The massive alien ship appeared above Earth without warning on a cold Tuesday morning. It hung in the sky, like a dark moon, and every government on the planet went into emergency mode. Within minutes, Commander Jake Morrison was pulled from his morning coffee at the Air Force Base and rushed to the Pentagon, where generals and politicians were already gathering in the secure briefing room. The ship was enormous, and clearly not from anywhere humans had ever been. Lieutenant Amy Brooks sat at the communications station with her headset on, and her face pale as she listened to something coming through the speakers. The message played out loud for everyone to hear, and it came in perfect English, which made everyone in the room uncomfortable, because that meant these aliens had been watching Earth for some time. The voice was cold and mechanical, and it called itself Exel-Thor from something called the Galactic Council. The message was simple and insulting. Earth had 7 days to surrender completely and dismantle every military force on the planet and accept council governance, or face what they called corrective pacification. Jake felt anger rise in his chest as he listened, because the tone made it clear these aliens saw humans as primitives who would simply obey out of fear. President Helen Carter sat in the Situation Room and replayed the message 3 times before she spoke. She was a former senator who had seen her share of bullies in politics, and she recognized one when she heard it. These aliens thought Earth would roll over and submit without a fight, and that assumption made her jaw tighten. She looked at General Paul Dixon, who commanded the Air Force, and asked him directly if Earth had any chance of fighting back. Dixon nodded slowly and told her about a project that had been running in secret for almost 15 years. Deep beneath the Colorado mountains, in a facility that officially did not exist, Dr. Lisa Grant had been working with a team of scientists on technologies that most people would call science fiction. When the government gave her access to the alien transmission data, she spent 72 hours straight analyzing every aspect of the ship's emissions. Her team mapped the energy signatures and ran probability models, and what they found gave Earth its first real hope. The alien shields were powerful, but they ran on a predictable rotating frequency pattern, and Lisa believed that with the right timing and the right weapons, Earth could punch through those shields. Jake Morrison volunteered immediately when they asked for pilots to lead the response team. He had flown combat missions in 3 different conflicts, and he was not about to let some alien empire take his home without a fight. Captain Ryan Hughes joined him because Ryan was the best tactical mind Jake had ever worked with, and Major Kate Sullivan signed up because her electronic warfare skills were going to be crucial if they wanted to blind the alien sensors. The 3 of them became the core of what would be called Eagle Squadron. The weapon systems came together faster than anyone expected, because Earth had been preparing for this possibility longer than most people knew. The experimental fighters had been built over 10 years in scattered facilities, and they used gravity manipulation technology that human scientists had developed from theoretical physics. The railguns mounted on the orbital defense platforms could accelerate metal slugs to incredible speeds using magnetic force. And Lisa Grant's team figured out exactly where to aim them to cause maximum damage to alien ships. Earth's answer to the Council ultimatum was broadcast on every frequency the aliens had used, and it was just one word: no. President Carter said it herself, standing in the Oval Office with her cabinet around her, and she made sure her voice was clear and strong. The aliens could come with their threats and their superior technology, but humanity was not going to surrender its freedom without making them pay a terrible price for it. Zalthor received Earth's response aboard his command ship, and he actually laughed, because in 10,000 years of Council expansion, no primitive species had ever refused the first ultimatum. He considered it an insult to his authority and to the Council's power, and he immediately ordered the fleet to attack. 20 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and took positions around Earth's orbit, their weapons powered up and their shields activated, and Zalthor sent one final message telling the humans this was their last chance to submit. Admiral Christopher Lane commanded Earth's defense from the orbital station Liberty, and he watched the alien ships arrange themselves with cold calculation. His fleet was smaller and theoretically outgunned, but he had advantages the aliens did not know about. Colonel Megan Price stood next to him, monitoring the alien positions and feeding data to the gun crews. Lane gave the order to hold fire, and let the aliens make the first move because he wanted them confident and careless. The Council ships opened fire with plasma weapons that should have disabled Earth's satellites and defense grid in the first Volvo. But the experimental deflector satellites that Earth had deployed absorbed most of the impact, and the shields held at 70% strength. The alien tactical officer reported the impossible result to Zalthor, who demanded to know how primitives had deflector technology. No one had an answer. Jake Morrison launched from the hidden base in Nevada, along with 40 other pilots in the Eagle fighters. The ships were sleek and fast, and they accelerated toward orbit, using thrust systems that would have seemed like magic 20 years ago. Jake's radio crackled with chatter from his squadron as they climbed, and he reminded them all to use their speed and maneuverability, because those were the advantages human pilots had over any alien. The Eagle fighters hit the alien formation like angry hornets, and the Council pilots found themselves unable to track the human ships. Ryan Hughes pulled maneuvers that generated forces that would have killed most alien species, but humans had evolved in Earth's gravity, and their bodies could take the punishment. Kate Sullivan activated her electronic warfare suite, and suddenly 3 alien ships were firing at targets that were not there while Eagle Squadron tore through their defensive formation. The battle turned when Lisa Grant identified the flagship's weak point and transmitted the coordinates to Admiral Lane. The USS Defiance lined up its railguns and fired a concentrated burst of magnetically accelerated metal that punched through the weakened shields and ripped into the alien ship's reactor core. Zalthor barely escaped in a pod before his flagship tore itself apart in a brilliant explosion that lit up the night sky over half the planet. The remaining Council ships broke formation and retreated, and Earth had won its first battle against an empire that had never known defeat. The Galactic Council chamber on Zentara Prime had stood for 5,000 years, and its walls had witnessed the submission of hundreds of species. But never had the elders gathered in such anger and confusion as they did 3 days after the battle at Earth. Elder Krath stood at the center of the curved assembly floor, with his mantis-like body rigid with fury, as he demanded explanations from Zalthor, who had survived the destruction of his flagship. The disgraced commander stood before the Council and tried to explain how primitive humans had destroyed 6 warships and forced a retreat. But his words sounded hollow even to himself. Elder Savannah, who was known for her wisdom and patience, suggested that perhaps the Council should reconsider their approach to Earth, because clearly the humans were more advanced than initial scans had indicated. But Krath would not hear of retreat or negotiation, because he believed that showing weakness to one species would encourage rebellion across the entire Council territory. He ordered the deployment of the Fifth Fleet, which consisted of 80 warships and was commanded by War Master Drex, who had never lost a battle in his 300 years of service. On Earth, the celebration of victory was brief because everyone knew the aliens would return with greater force. President Carter addressed the United Nations and laid out the reality of their situation. Earth had surprised the Council once, but surprise would not work a second time, and the next fleet would come prepared for human tactics. She proposed something that many thought was insane, which was to take the fight to Council territory before they could organize an overwhelming assault. The idea shocked many delegates, but Carter argued that staying defensive would only delay the inevitable. Jake Morrison was promoted to Commodore and given command of the strike force that would undertake what they called Operation Retribution. The plan was to use the alien wormhole gate that the Council had left near Jupiter and follow it back to one of their staging areas. Intelligence gathered from the wreckage of the destroyed ships gave Lisa Grant's team enough data to navigate the alien transportation network. 12 human warships were prepared for the mission, along with support craft and marine landing teams. The briefing room was packed with pilots and soldiers who would be making the jump into unknown space, and Jake stood before them, knowing that many might not come back. He told them the truth, which was that this mission was about sending a message to the Council that Earth would not wait to be attacked, but would strike first and strike hard. Captain Ryan Hughes would lead the bomber squadron, and Major Kate Sullivan would coordinate electronic warfare from her ship. Sergeant Danny Cooper commanded the Marine detachment, and he made sure his troops were ready for ground combat if needed. The fleet assembled near Jupiter, and the swirling energy of the alien wormhole gate looked like a tunnel into another dimension. Lisa Grant had programmed the navigation computers with the coordinates extracted from Council data cores, and she gave Jake a 70% chance that they would arrive at the right location. The other 30% could mean appearing inside a star or in deep space far from any solar system. Jake ordered the fleet forward, and one by one, the human ships disappeared into the alien gateway. They emerged in the Talon sector near a massive Council supply depot that served dozens of systems in that region of space. The facility was huge and designed to refuel and rearm Council military operations, but it had minimal defensive capabilities because no one had ever attacked Council logistics before. The depot commander, Overseer Plen, was reviewing inventory reports when alarms started screaming, and his sensors showed 12 unknown warships appearing from the gate. Jake gave the order to attack, and the human fleet opened fire with every weapon they had. The bombers came in low and fast-dropping. Explosive packages on fuel storage tanks and ammunition bunkers. Railgun fire tore through the depot's thin hull plating, and secondary explosions rippled across the entire facility. Ryan Hughes led his squadron through a pattern that maximized destruction, and within 15 minutes, the depot was a spreading cloud of debris and burning gas. But the real discovery came when Kate Sullivan's reconnaissance drones spotted something unexpected on the far side of the debris field. There were structures that looked like prison complexes, and thermal scans showed thousands of life forms being held in detention cells. Jake made an immediate decision that they were not leaving anyone behind in Council captivity. Danny Cooper's Marines loaded into assault shuttles and burned toward the prison facilities while the warships provided cover fire. The Marines breached the prison walls using plasma cutters and explosives and found themselves face-to-face with beings from species they had never seen before. Most were weak from poor treatment, but some were still strong enough to fight. One massive creature nearly 8 feet tall with gray skin and fierce eyes approached Danny and asked in broken English if the humans were here to fight the Council. Danny confirmed it, and the creature introduced himself as Torvak of the Vryn warrior caste. Torvak explained that his people had resisted Council rule 40 years ago and been crushed in a brutal war. The survivors had been scattered across Council prison camps and forced labor facilities. He looked at the human Marines with something like hope in his eyes and said that if Earth was truly fighting the Council, then the Vryn would fight beside them. Danny helped Torvak and thousands of other prisoners onto the human transport ships, while the warships held position against incoming Council patrol vessels. The battle to escape the Talon sector was fierce because Council reinforcements arrived faster than expected, but the human ships used the debris field for cover and their superior maneuverability to avoid concentrated fire. Kate Sullivan jammed Council communications and fed false sensor data that made one group of alien ships fire on another. The confusion bought enough time for the fleet to reach the wormhole gate and jump back to friendly space. When they emerged near Jupiter with 12 warships and 30 transport vessels full of freed prisoners, the news spread across Earth within hours. Humanity had not just defended itself but had struck deep into Council territory and freed slaves that the Council had held for decades. President Carter met with Torvak personally and offered the Vryn and other freed species asylum on Earth or help returning to their homeworlds. Torvak pledged that his people would fight alongside humanity against the Council tyranny. The raid on Talon sector changed everything because suddenly Earth was not alone in its resistance. News of the attack spread through Council space faster than their sensors could suppress it, and species that had been subjugated for generations started whispering about rebellion. The Council's appearance of invincibility had been shattered, and War Master Drex knew that his mission was no longer just about punishing one primitive world, but about crushing a growing resistance before it could spread. The weeks following the Talon sector raid brought changes to Earth that would have seemed impossible just months before. Alien refugees filled temporary settlements built in orbit around the moon, and human engineers worked alongside Vryn warriors and Melos scientists to share technology and knowledge. Torvak became an unofficial ambassador for the freed species, and he spent hours in meetings with President Carter and her military advisors, explaining the true scope of Council power and the weaknesses they tried to hide. The Melos were a species of brilliant engineers whose homeworld had been stripped of resources by Council trade laws that favored the ruling species. Their lead scientist was named Vulcan, and he brought technological knowledge that made human scientists practically dance with excitement. Lisa Grant worked with Vulcan to upgrade Earth's sensor arrays and weapon systems using a combination of human innovation and Melos precision engineering. The result was technology that neither species could have created alone. Other species began making contact through secret channels because the Council's information control was breaking down. The Kreen were merchants who had been exploited by Council taxation for centuries, and they offered their fast ships and knowledge of smuggling routes. The Solari were a peaceful species who had been forced to provide resources to Council military operations, and they desperately wanted freedom but had no weapons or warriors. Each species that reached out to Earth brought new capabilities and new reasons to fight. Admiral Christopher Lane now commanded operations from Unity Station, which was being built in high orbit beyond the Moon, using both human construction techniques and alien technology. The station would serve as headquarters for what they were calling the Coalition Fleet, which combined warships from Earth and the freed species. Colonel Megan Price served as his chief of staff, and she coordinated the complex logistics of integrating military forces that had never worked together before. The challenge was enormous, because each species had different communication systems and combat doctrines, and even basic things like airlock compatibility required engineering solutions. But necessity drove innovation, and within 3 weeks, the Coalition had established basic operational standards. Human pilots trained with Vrin gunners and Melos technicians maintained ships alongside human mechanics. The cultural exchange was chaotic, but it worked because everyone shared a common enemy. Jake Morrison found himself learning Vrin combat philosophy from Torvak during their spare time. The Vrin believed in direct assault and overwhelming force, while humans preferred maneuver and deception. Ryan Hughes joked that combining both approaches would give them tactics the Council had never seen before. Kate Sullivan worked with Kreen navigators to map out Council space and identify strategic targets for future operations. Meanwhile, in Council territory, Warmaster Drex was assembling the largest military force the galaxy had seen in 1,000 years. Unlike the arrogant Xal Thor, Drex did not underestimate humanity or their allies. He studied every engagement and analyzed human tactics with cold precision. He recognized that humans were unpredictable and creative, and that they excelled in chaotic situations where individual initiative mattered. His solution was to remove chaos from the battlefield entirely. Drex planned to engage the Coalition with a fleet of 100 warships organized in a rigid formation, with overlapping shields and synchronized weapons fire. His tactical doctrine eliminated individual ship commanders making decisions, and instead treated the fleet as a single weapon controlled from his flagship. The formation would advance slowly and methodically, crushing anything in its path through pure firepower and defensive strength. It was the opposite of human tactics, and that was exactly the point. The Council's intelligence network reported that Earth was building alliances, and Drex knew he had to strike before the Coalition grew stronger. He set course for the Sol system with his Annihilator fleet and sent a message ahead, warning that this time there would be no mercy and no escape. Elder Krath watched the fleet depart from Zentara Prime and told himself that soon the human problem would be solved and the Council's authority would be restored. On Earth, the news of the approaching Annihilator fleet caused controlled panic in government circles. 100 warships was more than double what the Coalition could field, even with all their allies combined. President Carter called an emergency meeting of Coalition leadership and asked the hard question of whether they should evacuate Earth's population or stand and fight. The debate lasted 6 hours and involved representatives from all the allied species. Torvak spoke for the Vrin and said his people would stand with humanity because running from the Council had never worked. Vaken agreed and pointed out that the Council would hunt them across the galaxy if they showed weakness now. The Kreen captain named Rilix said his merchant ships could evacuate civilians if needed, but he personally would rather fight. In the end, Carter made the decision that Earth would not abandon its home and the Coalition would meet the Annihilator fleet in battle. But meeting them in direct combat seemed like suicide, which meant they needed a different approach. The planning session brought together the best tactical minds from all the Coalition species, and they worked for 3 days straight, developing a strategy. Ryan Hughes proposed something that seemed insane, which was to attack the command structure while the fleets were engaged. If they could eliminate Drex and disable his flagship, the enemy formation would lose its coordination. The plan required a stealth insertion team to reach Drex's flagship during the battle, and that meant using a captured Council stealth ship that Lisa Grant and Vaken had been studying. The ship used advanced cloaking technology that bent light around its hull, but it required enormous power, which limited how long it could stay hidden. Lisa estimated they would have maybe 30 minutes of stealth before Council sensors adapted to detect the modified ship. Jake Morrison volunteered to lead the strike team, even though it was effectively a suicide mission. Ryan insisted on coming because tactical planning was his specialty, and Danny Cooper brought his best Marines because they would need elite soldiers to fight their way through a Council warship. Torvak demanded to be included because he knew Council ship layouts from the Vryn War decades ago. Kate Sullivan stayed with the fleet to coordinate electronic warfare, but she made Jake promise to come back. The team trained in virtual simulations of Council ship interiors and practiced close-quarters combat using captured alien weapons. The Marines learned to move through corridors designed for different species, body types, and they developed tactics for fighting enemies that might be larger or faster or have natural armor. Danny drove them hard because he knew mistakes would be fatal. As the Annihilator fleet approached the Sol system, Coalition forces gathered at Neptune, which Admiral Lane chose as the defensive line. The location gave them room to maneuver and put distance between the battle and Earth in case things went badly. Megan Price organized the fleet into 3 wings, with human ships forming the center, Vryn warships on the flanks, and Kreen vessels ready to harass enemy formations. The Melos provided sensor support, and the Solari contributed their few armed ships to the reserve. The night before the battle, Jake stood in Unity Station's observation deck, looking at Earth in the distance. Ryan found him there, and they did not talk much, because there was nothing left to say. They had a plan, and they had people willing to execute it, and tomorrow they would find out if courage and creativity could overcome superior numbers. Kate joined them, and the 3 original Eagle Squadron members watched the stars together, knowing that many of those stars were under Council control, but maybe not for much longer. The Annihilator fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of Neptune's orbit exactly when Drex's calculations predicted, and the sight of 100 massive warships appearing in formation sent a chill through every Coalition sensor operator who witnessed it. The Council ships were organized in precise geometric patterns, with their shields already overlapping to create layers of defensive coverage that would make them nearly impossible to destroy individually. Warmaster Drex sat in his command chair aboard the flagship Dominion and reviewed his battle plan one final time before giving the order to advance. Admiral Lane watched the enemy approach from Unity Station and felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders because he knew that thousands of lives depended on the decisions he would make in the next few hours. Colonel Megan Price stood beside him, coordinating communications between Coalition ships, and she could hear the tension in the voices of captains from a dozen different species. The human warships held the center of the defensive formation, while Vryn cruisers anchored the flanks with their heavy armor and powerful guns. Kreen merchant vessels modified with weapon systems darted at the edges, ready to exploit any opening. The distance between the fleets closed slowly, as Drex maintained his methodical advance, and Lane refused to give ground. When the range dropped to weapons distance, both sides opened fire simultaneously, and space lit up with energy beams and ballistic projectiles crossing the void between them. The Council's synchronized firing pattern concentrated massive firepower on single targets, and the Coalition lost 2 ships in the first minute of combat. But human railguns, firing metal slugs at relativistic speeds, punched through weakened shield sections and damaged Council vessels that had never encountered kinetic weapons with such penetrating power. Jake Morrison's strike team waited in the captured stealth ship, hidden in Neptune's upper atmosphere, watching the battle unfold on their sensors. The modified Council vessel was cramped with 10 people inside, including Jake, Ryan, Danny Cooper, and 6 Marines plus Torvak, whose massive frame took up the space of 2 humans. Lisa Grant's final calculations showed they needed to wait until the fleets were fully engaged before making their approach, so the Council sensors would be focused on the larger battle. The space battle intensified as Vryn ships charged the Council formation with tactics that shocked Drex, because the Vryn were willing to ram enemy vessels if it meant breaking the formation. Torvak watched his people fight through the stealth ship's view screen, and pride mixed with grief crossed his face. Ryan monitored the tactical situation and identified the moment when Council attention was most divided. He nodded to Jake, who gave the order to launch. The stealth ship accelerated away from Neptune using minimal thrust to avoid detection, and Kate Sullivan aboard the Coalition flagship activated her electronic warfare suite to create sensor ghosts that would mask their approach. The Mellows had enhanced the stealth field to bend electromagnetic radiation around the hull, but it consumed power so fast that their reactor was running at dangerous levels. They had 28 minutes before the cloak failed. Danny's Marines checked their weapons and prepared for boarding action, while Torvak reviewed the layout of Council command ships based on his memories from 40 years ago. The Vryn warrior explained that the command deck would be heavily defended, with automated weapons and elite guards, but there was a maintenance corridor that ran beneath the primary systems. If they could access that corridor, they might reach the command deck without fighting through the main security checkpoints. The battle raged around them as the stealth ship crossed the distance to the Dominion, and Drex's flagship was so massive it looked like a small moon bristling with weapons. Coalition forces were taking heavy losses, but they were inflicting damage too, and 3 Council ships had been destroyed while 5 more showed serious damage. Admiral Lane rotated damaged ships out of the line, while fresh vessels moved up, and Megan Price coordinated repair efforts on ships that could still fight. The stealth ship attached itself to the Dominion's lower hull, using magnetic clamps, and Danny's Marines activated plasma cutters to burn through the outer armor. The Council metal was tough, but human cutting tools were designed for salvage operations on destroyed ships, and they sliced through the hull in 90 seconds. The team dropped into a dark corridor that smelled of recycled air and alien machinery. Torvak led them forward with his weapon, ready, because Vryn had better low-light vision than humans. They moved through the ship like ghosts using hand signals because sound carried through the metal corridors, and Jake's combat experience told him speed was more important than stealth now that they were inside. The maintenance corridor, Torvak remembered, was exactly where he said it would be, and they crawled through a space barely large enough for humans, while Torvak had to squeeze his bulk through with difficulty. Emergency lighting gave everything a red glow, and the sound of the ship's systems hummed around them. Council security forces detected the hull breach 8 minutes after the team entered, and alarms started blaring throughout the ship. Drex received the report and immediately understood what was happening because humans had shown they preferred unconventional tactics. He ordered security teams to the command deck and activated the ship's internal defense systems. Automated turrets deployed from the ceiling in key corridors, and security doors slammed shut throughout the vessel. Jake's team emerged from the maintenance corridor into a junction that immediately lit up with weapons fire from an automated turret. 2 Marines went down before Danny destroyed the turret with a grenade, and the explosion echoed through the corridor like thunder. Torvak grabbed the wounded Marines and pulled them to cover, while the team medic worked frantically to stabilize their injuries. They could not afford to slow down, but Jake would not leave his people behind. Ryan found an access terminal, and Kate had given him hacking codes derived from captured Council computer systems. His fingers flew across the alien interface, and doors started opening ahead of them, while others locked behind to slow pursuing security forces. The ship's internal sensors showed them as red dots moving toward the command deck, and Drex watched their progress with cold calculation. He had elite guards waiting in the final corridor, and he was confident they would stop the human team. The firefight in the corridor outside the command deck was brutal, because Council elite guards wore powered armor and carried weapons that could punch through standard Marine body armor. Danny's team used grenades and suppressing fire, while Torvak charged forward with a roar that echoed off the metal walls. The Vryn warrior absorbed hits that would have killed a human and closed with the guards in hand-to-hand combat. His strength was enough to tear through powered armor, and his rage at decades of imprisonment drove him forward. Jake and Ryan pushed through the chaos and reached the command deck door, which was sealed with multiple security locks. Ryan planted shaped charges, while the Marines held off reinforcements coming from both directions. The explosion blew the door inward, and the team rushed into the command deck, where Drex stood waiting with a weapon in his hands and murder in his eyes. The Council War Master was massive, and his metallic scales were actual armor grown into his skin. He fired his weapon, and the energy beam missed Jake by inches and burned a hole in the wall behind him. Torvak engaged Drex directly, and the 2 giants crashed together like colliding planets. Ryan and Kate had taught Jake about Council command systems, and he spotted the main tactical control console that coordinated the entire fleet. Danny and his Marines fought off Council officers, who tried to defend their commander while Jake reached the console and started entering the override codes Lisa Grant had extracted from captured data. The system resisted at first, but human computer science had developed tricks for breaking security that Council programmers had never considered. Numbers scrolled across the screen, and suddenly Jake had access to the fleet coordination network. Outside in space, the Council formation began to falter, as ship commanders lost their synchronized firing solutions and overlapping shield coordination failed. Admiral Lane saw the enemy formation break apart and immediately ordered all coalition forces to press the attack. Vryn ships surged forward, targeting the gaps, while human railguns concentrated fire on individual vessels. 3 Council ships were destroyed in rapid succession, and others began retreating without orders. On the Dominion's command deck, Drex realized he was losing everything, and he activated the ship's self-destruct sequence, because if he could not win, he would take the humans with him. Warning klaxons started screaming, and a computerized voice announced that core destabilization was in progress. Jake looked at the countdown timer showing 3 minutes and shouted for everyone to evacuate immediately. Torvak had Drex pinned against a bulkhead, but the War Master triggered his personal shield and threw the Vryn warrior back. He looked at Jake with something like respect in his alien eyes and said that humans had proven themselves worthy opponents. Then he drew a blade and prepared to fight to the death because surrender was not in his nature. Jake did not have time for honor duels, and he shot Drex twice with a captured plasma weapon before grabbing Torvak and running. The team ran through corridors filled with smoke and emergency lighting, while the countdown to core destabilization ticked away in their heads, and every second felt like an eternity. Danny Cooper carried 1 wounded Marine, while another limped between 2 squadmates, and Torvak led them back toward their stealth ship, using his memory of the route they had taken. Council crew members fled past them in panic, and no one tried to stop the human boarding party, because everyone was focused on reaching escape pods before the flagship exploded. They reached the hull breach with 40 seconds remaining, and Ryan practically threw people through the opening into the stealth ship. Jake counted heads to make sure everyone was aboard before sealing the hatch, and Danny fired the magnetic clamps to release them from the Dominion's hull. The stealth ship's pilot pushed the engines to maximum acceleration, and they cleared the massive flagship with 15 seconds to spare. The Dominion's reactor went critical, and the explosion was visible from Earth as a new star that briefly outshone Neptune in the night sky. Without their flagship and War Master, the Annihilator fleet lost all coordination, and individual council captains made their own decisions about whether to fight or flee. Most chose to flee because they had joined the council military for security and advancement, not to die fighting primitives who refused to accept the natural order. Admiral Lane's coalition forces pursued the retreating ships and destroyed another 7 before Lane ordered them to break off because he would not waste lives hunting a defeated enemy. The battle was over, and humanity had won, but the cost was heavy. The coalition lost 18 ships, and nearly 3,000 personnel from multiple species died in the fighting. Unity Station became a hospital and repair facility as damaged vessels limped back from Neptune, and medical teams worked around the clock, treating wounded from species whose biology they barely understood. Lisa Grant and Vaughan coordinated with Melos medical specialists to develop treatment protocols that could help injured Vryn and Kreen and Solari warriors. Jake Morrison's team returned to Unity Station as heroes, but Jake felt only exhaustion and relief that his people had survived. The 2 wounded Marines would recover, and Torvak had taken hits that would have killed 3 humans, but Vryn physiology was remarkably tough. Kate Sullivan met them at the docking bay, and Jake saw tears in her eyes when she hugged him because she had watched the Dominion explode and feared the worst. Ryan just grinned and said the mission went exactly as planned, except for the parts that did not. News of the battle spread through Council space faster than their sensors could contain it, and the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Species that had been subjugated for generations saw that the Council was not invincible, and resistance movements began organizing on dozens of worlds. The Kreen used their merchant networks to spread information and coordinate uprisings. The Melos provided technical support for rebels, trying to disable Council monitoring systems. Even peaceful species like the Solari found courage to refuse Council demands. On Zentara Prime, the Council chamber descended into chaos, as elders blamed each other for the disaster. Elder Krath tried to maintain order, but his authority was broken, because he had promised that Drex's fleet would crush the human rebellion, and instead it had been destroyed. Elder Savannah proposed opening negotiations with Earth and the other rebel species, because continuing the war would only lead to more defeats. Other elders demanded immediate retaliation, but they could not agree on who should lead it or where forces would come from. President Helen Carter addressed not just Earth but the entire galaxy through transmissions that the Kreen broadcast on every major communication network. She spoke clearly about freedom and self-determination and the right of all species to choose their own path. She acknowledged that Earth had not sought conflict with the Council, but would not submit to tyranny. She offered alliance to any species that wanted freedom and promised that the coalition would protect those who could not protect themselves. The response was overwhelming as delegations from 40 species requested asylum or alliance with the coalition. Unity Station could barely handle the diplomatic traffic, and Carter had to establish protocols for evaluating requests, because some might be Council infiltrators. But most were genuine and represented people who had dreamed of freedom for generations. The galaxy was changing, and Earth stood at the center of that change. Admiral Lane met with coalition military leaders to discuss the future. And they all agreed that they could not simply defend human space, but needed to help liberate other species still under Council control. Torvak argued passionately for an expedition to free his homeworld, where Vryn civilians still suffered under occupation. Vakin wanted support for Melos resistance cells, preparing to overthrow their Council-appointed governors. The strategic situation was complex, but the moral imperative was clear. The coalition launched coordinated operations across Council space over the following months, and everywhere they went, they found species ready to fight for freedom. Human Marines fought alongside Vryn warriors to liberate occupied worlds. Kreen merchants supplied resistance movements with weapons and supplies. Melos engineers helped rebels sabotage Council infrastructure. The Solari provided humanitarian aid to displaced populations. It was not a traditional military campaign, but a galaxy-wide revolution. Elder Krath tried to organize a counteroffensive, but his orders were ignored by fleet commanders who no longer trusted Council leadership. Some Council species negotiated separate peace agreements with the coalition. Others simply withdrew from Council space and declared independence. The Grand Empire that had ruled for 10,000 years collapsed in less than a year because its foundation had always been fear, and once people stopped being afraid, the whole structure fell apart. The formal dissolution of the Galactic Council happened in the same chamber where elders had once commanded hundreds of species. Elder Savannah proposed replacing the Council with a voluntary federation where each species had equal representation and no one could impose their will on others. The proposal passed with support from most former Council members, and even Krath voted in favor because he recognized that the old order was finished. President Carter attended the founding assembly of the Galactic Federation, along with representatives from Earth and all the coalition species. She spoke about the cost of freedom and the responsibility that came with it. The new federation would have no emperors or overlords, but would be governed by consensus and respect for diversity. It was an idealistic vision, but after witnessing what determination could achieve, people believed it was possible. Jake Morrison stood on Unity Station's observation deck watching Earth turn slowly below and thinking about everything that had changed. A year ago, humanity had been alone and facing extinction from an alien empire. Now Earth was part of a galactic community, and human ships patrolled systems hundreds of light years from home. Ryan joined him with 2 drinks, and they toasted to the friends they had lost and the future they had won. Kate Sullivan received a promotion to captain and command of the exploration vessel Discovery, whose mission was to make contact with species in unexplored regions of the galaxy. She asked Jake if he wanted to join her crew, but he declined because he was tired of fighting and wanted time to process everything that had happened. Maybe later he would go back to the stars, but for now he needed to stay close to home. Torvak returned to his homeworld as a liberator and found that stories of his survival and alliance with humanity had made him a legend among his people. The Vryn rebuilt their civilization with human assistance and joined the Federation as equal members. Torvak never forgot that it was humans who gave his people a second chance, and the Vryn became humanity's closest allies in the new galactic order. Lisa, Grant, and Vakin continued working together, and their collaboration produced technologies that revolutionized space travel and communication. They developed faster engines and better weapons and medical advances that saved countless lives. The partnership between human creativity and Mello's precision became a model for scientific cooperation across the Federation. Danny Cooper trained the first integrated Special Forces unit, combining soldiers from multiple species and teaching them to work together despite their differences. The unit became the Federation's rapid response force for humanitarian missions and peacekeeping operations. Danny always said the best part of his job was watching former enemies become brothers in arms. President Carter served 2 more terms before retiring, and she lived to see humanity become respected leaders in galactic affairs, not through conquest, but through their commitment to freedom and justice. When she died, Earth held a state funeral attended by representatives from over 100 species, and her legacy was remembered as the woman who refused to let her world be enslaved. The galaxy never forgot how Earth stood against impossible odds, and won not just for themselves but for everyone who dreamed of freedom. Human became synonymous with courage and determination, and when other species faced tyranny, they often asked themselves what humans would do. The answer was always the same, which was to fight with everything they had and never surrender. Decades later, when historians studied the fall of the Galactic Council, they identified the moment Earth said no as the turning point that changed everything. One word from one species on one small planet in an unremarkable solar system had sparked a revolution that freed the galaxy. War Master Drex had been right about one thing, which was that humans were unpredictable and creative and dangerous when pushed into a corner. The Council provoked Earth, and they regretted it the moment humans struck back, because humanity taught the galaxy that freedom was worth fighting for, and tyranny could be defeated no matter how powerful it seemed.